She was 22 years old, and she had given 4 years of her earnings to a debt that was not hers to carry. When the last of it was paid, she looked at ve kep hart a te remained, $9, a canvas duffel, and a name she was no longer certain belonged to her. With $9, Mara Henley purchased a cable ferry hut, a tiny weather-beaten structure anchored to the bank of a fast-moving river in a valley in rural Appalachia, sealed since the county installed a road bridge in Mortninchin Bamy Mort. Inside sat the largest hand-cranked winch she had ever seen, and a steel cable still stretched across the current to the far bank. And inside the gearbox of that winch, inside a waterproof brass tube no one had touched in 50 years, she would find something that would change her life forever. Before we continue, if stories like this mean something to you, hit subscribe and tell us in the comments where you are watching from. We read every single one. Mara Henley had never been broke in the way that announces itself dramatically. She had been broke in the way that is chronic and invisible and deeply exhausting. The kind of broke that maintains the surface appearance of functioning while consuming everything underneath it. She had a job, a room, a working phone. She showed up on time and kept her commitments and did not ask for help, because asking for help would have required acknowledging that the financial structure she had built around her family's needs was not sustainable, and the acknowledgement would have felt like abandonment. So she continued instead, redistributing her income each month with the careful precision of someone managing a very small budget for a very large set of obligations, setting aside just enough for rent and food and nothing else, watching the savings she had intended to accumulate remain permanently at zero. Her mother's illness had come first, 3 years before, and the medical bills had been staggering in the particular way of American healthcare. Not all at once, which would at least have defined the problem clearly, but in a slow, continuous accumulation of statements and invoices and collection notices that arrived over months and continued arriving after the immediate crisis had passed. Mara had paid them systematically, working extra shifts and declining every social invitation that required spending money, treating the elimination of the debt as a project with a defined end state. She reached the end state. Then her brother needed. Then there was another smaller crisis and another. The end state kept receding. She was not angry about this. That was perhaps the most exhausting part. She was not angry. She was simply depleted, in the way that a battery is depleted when it has been discharging longer than it has been charging, not dramatically but continuously, until the reserve falls below the threshold required to sustain basic function. The decision to leave was not a decision in any dramatic sense. It was more like a calculation that finally resolved. She had been performing the same computation for 3 years, comparing what she gave to what she had, looking for a margin that did not exist, and on a Tuesday morning in October, sitting at her small desk with the last of the debt paid and $9 in her account, the computation simply arrived at a different answer. She was done. Not angrily, not resentfully, simply factually the way a river is done with a particular stretch of its course. It has moved through this terrain, it has done what it came to do, and now it continues. She had been reading the county property database as a habit, not from any specific intention, but because she was a person who processed anxiety through information, and the registry's draft. Factual inventories of distressed properties had become a kind of useful meditation, a catalogue of things that had been built for a purpose, and then left, which had a particular resonance for her at this point in her life. She found the cable ferry hut on a Wednesday, listed under a rural county in Appalachia, that she had no connection to and had never visited. The entry was brief. Structure, Mocham feet, timber frame, corrugated metal roof, cable ferry apparatus, hand-operated, intact, steel cable in place, condition unknown, all personal property of original operator remains, clearing lien, Chinchum Kongkong Dola. She had been to Appalachia once briefly as a child, visiting relatives she did not know kept well and would not have recognized now. What she remembered was the river, wide and fast and absolutely indifferent to the people watching it from the bank, a moving body of water that did not care about anything happening on either shore. She packed her duffel on Thursday night. On Friday morning, she took a series of buses south and west into the mountains. By Saturday afternoon, she was standing on the bank of a fast-moving river, reading a hand-drawn map on the back of the lien transfer receipt, watching the steel cable that stretched from the bank at her feet to a mooring post on the far side disappear into the brown current mid-cross. The decision to leave was not dramatic. It was more like a calculation that finally resolved after 4 years of running the same figures through the same variables and arriving at the same insufficient answer. She had been performing this computation since she was 18, comparing what she had to what was needed, looking for a margin that had never materialized, and on a Tuesday morning in October, sitting at the small desk in her room with the final debt confirmation letter in one hand and $9 in her account, the computation arrived at a different answer. She was done, not angrily, not resentfully, simply factually the way a river is done with a particular section of its course. It has moved through this terrain, it has done what physics required of it, and now it continues. She had developed the habit of reading the county property database as a way of managing anxiety through information. The registry dry, factual lists of distressed properties, abandoned structures, delinquent tax parcels, machinery left in place, had become a kind of quiet meditation for her over the preceding months, a catalogue of things built for specific purposes and then left. She found the cable ferry hut on a Wednesday evening listed under a rural Appalachian county she had no connection to. The entry was brief: structure, Mocham Hymiskew feet, timber frame, corrugated metal roof, cable ferry apparatus, hand-operated, intact, steel cable in place. Condition unknown. All personal property of original operator remains. Clearing lien Chin Chum Kum Dola. She had $9. She had seen the word intact. She packed her duffel on Thursday and took a series of buses south and west into the mountains, arriving at the Valley Road on a Saturday afternoon, reading a hand-drawn map on the back of the lien transfer receipt, while the bus station receded behind the last ridge and the river sound began. That specific, persistent sound of water moving fast through a narrow valley that is present everywhere in Appalachia and is the sound of time moving at its own pace regardless of anything happening on either bank. The cable ferry hut stood at the water's edge with the settled, patient quality of a structure that had been built to be permanent and had survived several decades of abandonment without conceding the. It was small, perhaps 12 feet by 10, built from heavy timber with a corrugated metal roof that had rusted to a deep, warm orange and showed no sign of leaking where the panels overlapped. The single door was secured with a padlock that had swollen ve kep hat rust, and Mara spent 20 minutes working it free with a sequence of penetrating oil from a can she had purchased at the county co-op on her way down the access road, applied in rounds with 15 minutes between each application. The door opened inward, stiff but not damaged, revealing the interior in a single long view. The hut was essentially one room. Against the far wall, taking up perhaps a third of the floor space, sat the hand-cranked winch, a massive assembly of cast iron and steel, anchored to the floor with heavy lag bolts and connected to the steel cable through a series of sheaves mounted to the front wall at water level. The cable itself passed through a sealed port in the timber frame, ran across the current held just above the water's surface by the tension of the winch, and disappeared toward the far bank in a long, shallow catenary curve that was still, after 50 years, geometrically sound. The winch was the dominant fact of the space. It was not a delicate piece of equipment. It was a machine designed to haul a flat-bottomed ferry boat, capable of carrying a small vehicle, several animals, or a dozen people, across a fast-moving river using human power alone. which meant it was built with the kind of engineering redundancy and structural excess that such a task demands. The main drum was perhaps 18 inches in diameter and 2 feet wide. The gear train that multiplied the operator S input was a system of interlocking cast iron gears, each tooth individually machined, running through 3 stages of reduction to achieve the mechanical advantage required to move a loaded ferry against a strong current. The whole assembly was solid, massive, and completely seized verkepite had 50 years of rust. The geography of the valley imposed itself differently as the weeks passed. She had arrived in October, when the leaves were at peak colour, the ridgelines running red and gold against the pale sky, the river reflecting the same colours in its surface in the calmer sections between the rapids. By November the leaves were down and the ridges were bare, the valley walls reduced to their structural elements. Grey rock face, dark timber, the pale lines of old deer trails along the contours, and the landscape became more legible in its fundamental. By December, with the first snow on the higher elevations and the river running clear and cold at its winter level, the valley had the quality of something fully revealed, nothing obscuring the lines of the thing, every structural component visible. She liked the winter valley better than the autumn one, which surprised her. She had expected the colour to be the beauty and the bare branches to be the loss. Instead, the colour had been the surface and the bare branches were the structure, and structure, she was discovering, was what she had needed to be near. The stone walls of the valley did not shift. The river ran in the channel it had been running in for 10,000 years. The cable ferry post on the far bank was where it was and would be where it was next winter. The ridgelines were where the ridgelines were. This structural permanence, the quality of a landscape that has been shaped by forces operating on geological timescales and does not rearrange itself to accommodate the people who live in it, was the thing she had been missing without knowing she was missing it. She had spent 4 years in a household context and then a working context where the structures were all social and therefore mutable, where what counted as adequate could change on someone else's assessment of it, where what counted as done was never fully done because the definition kept shifting. The valley did not shift, the river did not change its mind. The work of crossing it was the same work every crossing, the current, the cable, the gears, the far bank, and the work being the same every time was not monotony, it was stability. It was the first stable environment she had inhabited since early childhood, and she was living inside it with the careful, attentive gratitude of someone who understands the value of a thing precisely because they have been without it for a long time. She kept the hut itself in the condition Bray had kept it. The tools were on their hooks, the pegs held the foul weather gear, the lantern and fuel occupied the same spot on the shelf, the logbook sat on the same narrow ledge above the workbench. She had added things, her own composition notebooks of crossing records, the mechanical reference manuals, a water level chart that tracked her own 2 years of readings alongside Bray's historical data, but she had not changed the arrangement Bray had established. The additions sat alongside the originals rather than replacing them. The hut had a character she did not want to alter, the character of a working space that has been organised by experience rather than by preference, by the accumulated understanding of what the work required rather than by any aesthetic consideration. She had organised her own additions on the same principle. The bench seat where passengers waited during suspended crossings had acquired, over 2 seasons, a particular patina of use, the wood worn smooth along the seat rail, a collection of small marks and notches in the surface from the gear, hardware and tools of the people who had sat there. She had considered refinishing it and decided against it. The marks were a record, the smooth rail was a record. The hut was accumulating the evidence of its use, the way a well-used tool accumulates evidence of use, and this accumulation was not damage, it was the material history of the crossing, written in the surface of the things that the crossing required. She thought about Clement Brayer's body in the context of his hands. His hands, which she had never seen, had operated this winch every working day for 41 years. They had been shaped by the work, collused on the palm where the crank handle sat, strong in the specific muscle groups that cranking develops, marked at the wrists by the fabric of the oilskin gloves they wore in wet weather. She had a set of oilskin gloves of her own now, purchased in her first winter, already marked at the wrists in the same way. Her hands were becoming hands that had operated this winch. Not brace hands, hers, shaped by her own 3 years rather than his 41, but hands shaped by the same work, the same crank, the same cable under load, the same resistance of the current. There was a continuity in this that was not about sentiment. It was about the fact that tools and bodies change each other through sustained contact, and that this mutual shaping is one of the things that makes a craft rather than simply a task. The personal effects of the original operator were still present, as the county registry entry had noted, arranged in the hut with the ordered specificity of someone who had maintained this space as a working environment for many years. A narrow shelf along the south wall held a kerosene lantern and a tin of fuel, a compass in a leather case, a tide chart for the watershed outdated but precisely folded, a first aid kit in a waterproof tin, and a small shortwave radio that was clearly non-functional, but had been kept because the operator did not throw things away that might conceivably be repaired. Below the shelf, a wooden pay-go rack held a set of oilskin foul-weather gear, jacket and trousers and a sou'wester hat, that had been hung with care and was still structurally intact, the oilskin dried and stiff but not cracked. Beneath the gear, a pair of rubber-soled work boots stood kept at their toes against the baseboard, laced and ready. The floor of the hut was swept clean. This was not a space that had been abandoned in panic or confusion. Someone had closed it deliberately, cleaning as they went, organizing the contents as if they expected to return or expected someone else to find the space in working order. The detail that struck Mara most was the boots. They were placed at their toes against the baseboard rather than set at random angles, in the specific way of someone who carpete their equipment in a state of readiness. This was an Operator S hut, and the operator had treated it as such to the very end. Some sanctuaries are not abandoned, only waiting for the right hands to find them. She did not know this yet, standing in the doorway of the hut with her duffel on the floor behind her and the sound of the river steady and indifferent just outside. But she registered the intentionality of the space, the care embedded in its arrangement, and set her bag down with a care that matched. She had not planned to sleep in the hut that first, but the light failed faster in the valley than she expected. The steep ridges on both sides cutting off the sky and pulling the dusk in 2 hours earlier than it would arrive at elevation. And by the time she had filled the kerosene lantern and established the minimum conditions of shelter, the darkness on the river was absolute. The river was louder in the dark, not louder in any objective sense, but more present, more demanding of attention, a continuous rush of water over rock and gravel that filled the auditory space the way light fills a room, making everything else She lay on the narrow bench along the north wall, which had clearly served as a cot for the ferry operator on long or overnight crossings, padded with a canvas-covered cushion that smelled of dust and old cotton and carried no dampness. She listened to the river and did not sleep immediately. She was not anxious. That was the most remarkable thing about lying there in the dark, the specific absence of the anxiety that had been present in her body as a constant background state for 4 years. The river did not care about medical debt. The river did not care about her brother S. rent or her mother S. disappointment that Mara had finally stopped answering the phone. The river was simply moving at its own velocity through its own terrain, following the gradient the landscape had established for it long before anyone on either bank had a name for river. She had been managing the anxiety of obligation for so long that she had forgotten it felt like to exist without it. Now she was experiencing the strange, slightly disorienting sensation of a burden genuinely removed. Not resolved, her family's financial situation had not changed, and the relationships it represented had not changed, but removed from her. She had carried it as far as she could carry it. She had set it down. She was lying in a small timber hut on the bank of a river in Appalachia, and the river was making the only sound in the valley, and she was not responsible for anything downstream. She was asleep within 20 minutes, for the first time in years, without fighting it. There was a particular quality to the light on the river in early morning in the autumn, when the mist had not yet lifted, and the ridges on either side held the light above the valley floor until mid-morning. She had first noticed it in her second week in the valley, and had stopped noticing it as remarkable by the second month, because noticing it as remarkable would have required a continuous state of novelty that the daily repetition of the light eroded. By the first autumn she simply saw it, the mist on the water, the ridges holding the sky, the cable S profile visible above the mist where it crossed the highest point of its catenary arc. She checked the water level gauge through the mist by feel and memory as much as by sight, because she had taken the reading from the same position every morning for months, and her body knew the distance and the angle to the gauge without calculation. This was a different relationship with a place than she had had vacate at any previous place she had lived. She had always been, before the valley, a person who had accommodated herself to places rather than accumulated a felt knowledge of them, adapting to each new apartment's quirks, learning the layout of each new building, developing a functional familiarity that stopped well short of the intimate knowledge of a space that comes from inhabiting it continuously and attending to its details over time. The valley had given her this intimate knowledge for the first time, and it had happened not through intention but through repetition. She had been here every morning. The mist had been here every morning. The gauge had been at the same position every morning, and across enough repetitions, the felt knowledge had accumulated without her choosing to accumulate it. She thought about this in the context of what Bray had had. 41 years of this same accumulation, this same daily repetition of the water level reading, and the equipment check and the crossing record. 41 years of the same valleyous light, the same cable S profile, the same resistance in the crank handle at different water levels. He had not needed to remember any of this consciously by the end of it. It had been in his body, the way the distance to the gauge was in hers after 2 years. The body holds what the daily work deposits in it. This is a different kind of knowing than the knowing that comes from study or reasoning, and it is, she was finding, more durable. The winch was the central problem and the central object. It occupied the hut the way a furnace occupies a boiler room. Not just physically, though it filled the space with its mass, but functionally, as the reason the space existed at all. Every other element in the hut was subordinate to the winch, the shelf of supplies for the operator who worked it, the bench where the operator rested between crossings, the pegs where the operator's foul weather gear hung ready for the river conditions that inevitably required. The hut was a shelter for the person who operated the machine. The machine was the point. Mara spent the second day examining it. She brought no mechanical knowledge to this examination. Her working life had been in a grocery distribution warehouse, managing inventory, and her skills were fundamentally organizational rather than mechanical. But she was precise and patient, and she applied these qualities to the winch the same way she had applied them to her Family S finances. Systematically, without rushing, looking at each component in relation to the others rather than in isolation, building a mental model of the whole from the part. The gear train was the most complex element. She identified 3 stages of reduction. The first gear, attached directly to the crank handle, was large and moved slowly. It engaged a second gear of a much smaller diameter, which in turn engaged the third stage connected to the main cable drive. This arrangement meant that one full rotation of the crank handle produced only a small rotation of the drum, but with the force multiplied by the gear ratio in each stage, which she estimated from the relative sizes of the gears was substantial. The trade was speed for force. A loaded ferry crossing a fast current could not be hauled by direct human power. The gear reduction made it possible by converting the operator S endurance into the mechanical force required to overcome the current S push. The gears were completely seized. She tested Exehat's stage with a section of steel bar she found under the bench, applying increasing pressure counterclockwise and clockwise to each gear in turn, and found no movement in any of them. The rust had penetrated the gear teeth and the shaft bearings and the drum assembly, bonding everything into a single, immovable block of oxidized iron. To restore the winch to function, she would need to address each seized component individually, and she did not yet know how. She spent the first afternoon measuring the steel cable. She had no instrument for this beyond a length of string and the tape measure from her bag, but she was methodical. She walked the near bank section from the hut-S wall fitting to the point where the cable entered the water, noted its and used the geometry she had learned from Marcus's sketch of the catenary curve to estimate the total span. The river was approximately 80 feet wide at this crossing. The cable was substantially longer than that. Catenary geometry requires more length than the direct span, the amount depending on the sag at the midpoint. The mooring post on the far bank was the element she could not assess from this side. She could see it was still in place, still vertical, the cable still attached, but the condition of the concrete footing and the post-S attachment hardware were invisible at 80 feet across fast-moving water. This was the unknown she would need to address before she could trust the cable to take load. She added it to her list. Far bank mooring post. Inspect when possible. The list itself was expanding. She had started it on the first day with 3 items: winch condition, cable condition, hull condition, and it now covered both sides of 2 pages in her co-op notebook. Each item on the list represented something she did not yet know how to do, or something that required resources she did not yet have. Neither of these conditions distressed her. She was accustomed to working with incomplete information and insufficient resources. 4 years of managing family debt under those conditions had made it a familiar operating environment. The difference was that here, the deficit was finite and the resources were now available to address it. The $44,000 was not a windfall in the emotional sense. It was a maintenance budget. It was enough. She made a point of reading Clement Bray's logbook for an hour each evening before sleep. She had read it through twice by the end of the first week, and was now reading it a third time, differently, not looking for the information the entries contained which she had largely absorbed, but looking at the quality of attention the entries represented. 41 years of 1 entry per day, recording what the river was doing and what the crossing required. 41 years of showing up and paying attention and writing it down. She was trying to understand what that looked like as a life, from the inside. The valley had a particular rhythm in October that she had not encountered in the cities she had lived in. The mornings were cold and still, the mist sitting on the river until mid-morning, when the light reached the water's surface and burned it off. By midday the valley was in full sun, the ridge walls focusing the light downward in a way that made the air substantially warmer than the elevation suggested. By 4 in the afternoon the ridges cut off the direct sun, and the temperature dropped quickly, the mist reforming over the water as the warm river met the cooling air. She learned to organize her outdoor work, the cable inspection, the wall fitting checks, the hull assessment. Between the morning mist and the afternoon shadow, the 2.5 hours of clear, useful light that the valley provided each day. This imposed a discipline she had not sought and found genuinely useful. She had always been a person who worked by the task, starting a project and continuing until it was finished, regardless of the hour, and this approach had served her in the warehouse environment, where the inventory did not close until the last box was processed. The valley did not support this approach. The light was finite, the cold was real. When the mist came back and the temperature dropped in the afternoon, outdoor work became uncomfortable and eventually impractical, and she had to stop whether the task was complete. The forced incompleteness was initially frustrating and eventually clarifying. She began planning her days around what the light allowed rather than around what the task demanded. She broke larger projects into the segments that fit within the available light, and worked each segment completely before stopping. leaving the next segment clearly identified and ready to begin the following morning. The projects advanced more slowly than her instinct said they should and faster than she had initially feared they would. The river moved at the speed the gradient required. She was learning to move at the speed the valley required. Some sanctuaries are not abandoned, only waiting for the right hands to find them. The valley had been waiting for someone who would accept its pace. She found the gearbox housing on the third day. She had been cleaning the winch systematically, working from the outside in, removing the thick accumulation of rust scale and river-borne sediment from the exterior surfaces with a stiff wire brush and the remaining penetrating oil. The work was slow and produced a fine red-brown dust that settled on everything in the hut and got into her hair and the folds of her clothes. She had developed a rhythm for it: scrub a section, wipe clean, examine the surface exposed, assess whether the metal beneath was sound, move to the next section. The gearbox was a separate housing, a cast-iron box perhaps 14 inches square and 6 inches deep, bolted to the main frame of the winch assembly on the downstream side. It contained the third stage reduction gearing, the final step between the intermediate gear train and the cable drum, and it was sealed with a cast-iron cover plate held by 8 bolts. The bolts were deeply rusted, as everything else on the machine was deeply rusted, but they were bolt pattern consistent, which meant removing them with the correct socket size was possible in theory, if not immediately in practice. She walked up the access road to the county co-op the following morning and purchased a socket wrench set, more penetrating oil, a mallet, and a bag of coarse steel wool. The total came to just under $30, which she charged to a credit card she had maintained in her name alone throughout the years of family debt. With a small available balance she had never touched because it represented the last reserve she had. Spending it on tools for a machinery restoration project she had no plan for felt, in the valley light on the road back to the hut, like the most rational decision she had made in years. She applied the penetrating oil to each of the 8 bolts in sequence, waiting an hour between applications, and used the morning of the following day to remove them. 6 came free with reasonable effort. The 7th required the mallet and a long extension on the socket wrench. The 8th was broken and required drilling, which required a trip back to the co-op and a day's wait for the bit to arrive from the county hardware store. When the cover plate finally lifted clear, she set it on the bench and looked into the gearbox in the lantern. The gearbox interior was coated in the thick, dark residue of old gear oil that had oxidized over decades into something with the consistency of pine tar. The gears themselves were visible through the residue, large, precisely cut cast-iron teeth, each one individually machined and still geometrically sound despite the coating. She examined each one in the lantern light, checking for cracking or deformation, and found none. The gears were good. The housing was good. The problem was entirely chemical. The oil had oxidized and the rust had bonded the shafts in their bearings, but the underlying components were intact. And then she saw the tube. It was resting in the deepest part of the gearbox housing, lodged between the lower gear shaft and the inner wall of the casting, at a point where the normal disassembly of the gear train would not immediately disturb. It was brass, a cylinder perhaps 10 inches long and 2 inches in diameter, with threaded end caps that had been sealed vacate by Tehat, what appeared to be a rubber gasket compound, now dried and darkened with age. It was clearly not a component of the gearbox. It was not cast iron. It had no mechanical function in the gear train. Someone had placed it there deliberately, at a point in the housing where it was recessed enough to be missed by anyone cleaning the gearbox without removing the cover plate, accessible only to someone who had done exactly what she had DUAT done. Removed all 8 bolts, lifted the cover, and looked carefully at what was inside. She reached into the housing and lifted the tube free. It was heavier than its size suggested, dense with whatever was inside it. The brass was tarnished but uncorroded. Brass does not rust, and the sealed housing had kept it dry despite 50 years of Appalachian humidity. She held it in both hands at the edge of the lantern light and turned it slowly, reading the surface of the metal, the way she had learned to read the gear teeth, looking for information rather than drawing conclusions before the examination was complete. The end caps were threaded. She tried the right cap first. It moved on the second attempt, a quarter turn, then another, then free. She looked into the open end of the tube. The tube contained two things, a roll of currency sealed in a waxed paper cylinder, and a waterlogged composition book that proved, when she gently eased it free and let it fall open, to be a ferry operator-S logbook, not water-damaged because the brass tube had kept it dry for half a century, but marked with the careful, deliberate handwriting of someone who had recorded every crossing they ever made. She set the logbook on the bench and counted the currency by the light of the kerosene lantern. It took a long time. The bills were old, large denomination notes from the late Mortninchin Salmi Gay and early Mortninchin Bay Misses, and they were tightly rolled and compressed by the tube, requiring careful, gentle unrolling that took patience. When she had finished, the total was $44,000, laid out across the bench in ordered stacks, the lantern light catching the ink on each note and the paper soft with age but completely intact. $44,000, sealed in a waterproof brass tube, inside the gearbox of a hand-cranked ferry winch, in a sealed hut on the bank of an Appalachian river, for 50 years. She sat with the money and the logbook and the open tube in the lantern light for a long time without touching any of it further. The river was audible through the walls of the hut, steady, continuous, not quite white noise, always slightly variable, always moving. She had been living on a river for 4 years in a different sense, moving through obligations that felt as uncontrollable and as permanent as a current, doing what the terrain required of her, keeping her head above the surface, reaching the far bank when she reached it and not before. She had spent 4 years in a current, now she was on the bank. She picked up the logbook and began to read. She thought often about the mechanism of the gear train as she worked to restore it, specifically about what it meant as an engineering principle, to trade speed for force. The gear reduction did not create power, it converted one form of it into another. The operator cranking the handle was producing a given amount of rotational force. The gear train took that force, reduced the speed of rotation at each stage, and delivered it to the drum at a much lower rotational speed, but with a much higher. The work done was the same, only its expression had changed. She had been working at full speed for 4 years and producing insufficient torque. The rotation rate had been high, shifts at the warehouse, extra shifts, the constant cycling through obligations and payments and follow-up calls, but the output had been barely sufficient to maintain position against the current, let alone make progress across it. What she had needed, and what the winch-S gear train provided, was a reduction in speed that produced an increase in force, slower but with enough torque to actually move the load. She had not chosen to come to the valley at a slower pace. She had come because she had no money and no plan and $9 and the word intact in a property registry entry, but the valley had imposed the slower pace, and the slower pace was producing results that the faster pace had not. The cable wall fitting was checked thoroughly. The gearbox was addressed component by component. The hull caulking was done correctly rather than quickly. The verification happened at the end when the hull went on the water, and it had held. Force over speed, torque over rotation rate. The river had been there the whole time, running at its own speed, indifferent to how quickly she needed to cross it. The gear train was the acknowledgement of this indifference. It did not argue with the current. It provided the force to cross. The ferry operator-S logbook was a standard composition book, its cover water-stained at the edges despite the protection of the brass tube, its pages dense ver kepiter hat entries in a small, precise hand that had clearly been formed over decades of regular writing. The entries were dated and brief, a record of crossings made, conditions observed, events noted. Each entry followed the same format: date, water level, current speed measured by a method the operator referenced as the stick method, which Mara eventually understood to mean timing a floating stick over a measured distance, number of passengers and cargo, weather, and any unusual circumstance. The first entry was dated April Mui Hai, Motnin Shin Cham Bar Mui. The last was dated September Bar, Motnin Shin Bei Mi Mort, the day before the county road bridge had opened 2 miles upstream and rendered the ferry crossing obsolete. 41 years of daily entries, compressed into a composition book that smelled of old paper and brass and the particular dryness of a sealed container. She read the early entries slowly, learning the operator S shorthand and the rhythms of the crossing. The ferry served an agricultural community on the far bank, farms, a small sawmill, a church, a school that the children on the far side attended by crossing the river in all weather and all seasons. The crossings were not casual. In spring, the river ran high and fast with snow melt, and the winch required 2 operators on the worst days, one cranking, one monitoring the cable tension and the ferry S angle against the current. In summer, the water was lower, but the gravel bars shifted, requiring constant attention to the ferry S draft. In autumn, the current carried debris, tree branches, the occasional log, twice in the 41-year record, a section of collapsed upstream bank that could foul the cable or the ferry S. The operator, whose name Mara found on the first page, was Clement Bray, had recorded all of this with the same steady, unexcited precision. He did not editorialize, he did not complain. He noted facts: the water was high, the crossing took longer, the cable tension was adjusted. He noted the crossings that went wrong and what had been done to correct them. He noted the crossings that went particularly well without any additional commentary. The logbook was not a personal journal, it was an operational record, but the 41 years of it, read in sequence, constituted something more than a record of crossings. It was a record of a person paying close, sustained attention to a single thing over a very long time. The final entries were the ones she returned to most often in the days that followed. The last week of August, Morchind Beimimot, and the first 3 days of September were recorded with the same precise brevity as every other period, but if you read them knowing they were the last entries in a 41-year sequence, a different quality became apparent. Not sentimentality, which Clement Bray did not appear to traffic in, but a particular attention to the riverous ordinary character. August Bar Mi, Mortnin Chin Bei Mi Mort. Water level Bacumborn fit. Current moderate. Crossings Sow morning farm traffic. Afternoon school run both ways. One special crossing for the Halley family moving furniture. No unusual conditions. The light on the far bank in the late afternoon is very good today. August Bar Mi Mot. Mortnin Chin Cham Bei Mi Mort. Water level Bathang Ba fit. Current moderate. Crossings Bay. Weather changed mid-afternoon. Brief hard rain. Crossing was suspended for bone me minutes. Resumed without incident. River smelled of rain. September Mort, Mortchincham Bay Mi Mort, water level, Barcham high feet. Current light. Crossings, Bon. Children from the Far Bank School came across for the last time on this ferry. County bus will collect them from the bridge starting next week. They were noisy coming over and quiet going back. This is usually how it goes when something is. September High. Mortnin Chin Bei Mi Mort. Water level Bartang Mort fit. Current light. Crossings high. The Halley family again, returning for items they left behind. Mrs. Halley asked if Mott was all right. Mott said yes. September Bar Bei Mi Mort. Water level Barcham cum feet. Current light. Crossings Mort Final crossing. Morning, Gerald Witt and his son taking the dairy herd to the upland pasture. The cattle were calm. The crossing took high minutes. Mort cleaned the hut and checked the winch and oiled the cable. Mort have put what needed to be put away into the gearbox. Whoever finds it, you cannot control the river, you can only pull yourself across it. That has always been in. She read the last entry 3 times. Then she set the logbook down on the bench with the same deliberate care she had used to set down her duffel when she first entered the hut. And she sat for a long time looking at the winch. You cannot control the river. You can only pull yourself across it. She had been trying to control the river for 4 years. That was the most accurate description of what she had been doing. Not managing debt, not supporting her family, not fulfilling obligations, though it had been all of these things as well. She had been trying, through sheer discipline and sustained effort and the systematic application of everything she earned, to control something that was not controllable. Medical bills arrive when illness arrives, not when you are financially prepared for them. Family members have needs that do not coordinate with your capacity to meet them. The current does not adjust to the Ferry S schedule. What Clement Bray had done for 41 years was different. He had not tried to control the river. No one who operated a cable ferry in Appalachia for 4 decades had any illusions about controlling the river. He had established a fixed line across it, maintained that line through every condition the river presented, and pulled, steadily, every time a crossing was required. He had not tried to make the current slower or the high water lower or the debris years less frequent. He had shown up every morning, checked the water level and the cable tension, opened the hut and done the work the crossing required. That was all. That had been enough for 41 years for everyone on both banks who needed to. She picked up the logbook again and read forward from the beginning, slowly this time, not looking for anything specific, simply reading the accumulated record of a person who had learned to work with a river rather than against it, and found in that accumulated record something she could not have articulated clearly but recognized, with the particular recognition of finding something you needed before you knew you needed it, as the answer to a question she had been asking without knowing she was asking. The financial architecture of Mara S. 22 years had been constructed in a particular way that she only understood fully after she left it. From the outside, it had looked like a functioning system. Income coming in, obligations going out, accounts staying roughly current. The architecture held, but a system can hold while also consuming everything that passes through it, converting all available resource into the minimum required to maintain the system itself, with nothing accumulating beyond the maintenance threshold. This was the architecture she had built, not from any design failure, but from the specific requirement she had been operating under. There was never more than exactly enough, because she was using exactly enough to hold a structure that required it. The Cable Ferry S financial architecture was different in the same way that its mechanical architecture was. The gear reduction was not just a mechanical principle, it was also, as she thought about it during the long rhythmic work of cranking the heavy machinery through its restoration, an economic principle. You could apply everything you had at full speed and produce insufficient torque, or you could reduce the rate and increase the force and actually move the load. Her family's financial situation had required her to apply everything at full speed for 4 years. It had not moved the load. She had maintained the system while the load stayed where it was. She had needed to get slower, not less committed. She was not less committed to her mother's well-being or her brother's stability. She had needed to get slower about the mechanism and let the outcome take the time it took. The medical bills had been paid. The accounts had been settled. These had been the right crossings to make, and she had made them. But she had been trying to also move the far bank while she crossed, and the far bank does not move. Her mother would continue to have health challenges. Her brother would continue to have financial uncertainty. These were the conditions on the far side of the river, and she could cross to them when she was crossing. and she could not change them from the near bank by worrying at them from a distance. The river was between them. She could cross it. She could not remove. The logbook contained other things that Clement Bray had placed in it deliberately. Between certain pages he had folded small pieces of paper, not the random interleaving of someone who uses logbooks as general-purpose storage, but specific notations at specific points in the record. Some were technical, sketches of the cable S catenary angle at different water levels, with notes on how the crank resistance changed as the sag increased. Some were mathematical, calculations of the gear ratio at different stages, the mechanical advantage expressed as a multiplier of input force. Some were observational, notes on the River S character at different seasons, the specific conditions that preceded flash floods, the signs that the cable tension was approaching a critical threshold and needed adjustment before the next cross. And some were something else. At page 64, dated July Mothin Chin Bon Mi Tu, he had folded a piece of paper that said simply, "When the current is at its strongest, grip the handle with your whole hand, not just your fingers. Your hand will tire later and your grip will not slip." This took me 3 years to learn. At page 112, dated March Motchin Non Mi Hai, a piece of paper said, "The ferry does not know it is crossing. The people on it know. Keep your attention on the cable and let them keep their attention on the far bank. That is the correct division of labour." At page 147, dated November Motchin Sao Mi Mot, a piece of paper said, "There was a flood this year that Mott was certain would take the cable. The cable held. Mott have been underestimating the cable for 30 years. Mott will try to stop doing this." And at the final page, tucked behind the last entry, a piece of paper said, "The river has taught me everything Mott know. Mott do not know the river. Mott can know of they kept what to do while Mott am crossing it. This is sufficient." She read each of these twice. Then she found a piece of paper in her bag and wrote them all down, in her own handwriting, in the composition notebook she had bought at the county co-op for grocery lists. She was not sure what she was writing them down for. She wrote them down because they were true, and because she had not encountered many true things recently. The logbook contained 41 years of water level readings. Clement Bray had recorded the River S level every morning for 4 decades, measuring it with a gauge he had installed on the near bank mooring post, a painted iron rod with markings at half-foot intervals. The gauge was still there, faded but legible, and she used it each morning to take the day S opening reading in the same format he had used, water level, X. Over the course of her first 2 years, she accumulated her own record alongside. She had the summer levels, the autumn recession, the winter stable period, the spring flood, and she had this sequence twice, in 2 consecutive years, which began to give her enough comparative data to see patterns. The spring flood in the second year was higher than the first. The snowpack had been heavier that winter, but it receded at approximately the same rate. The summer drought in the first year had dropped the water level lower than the second summer S drought. She could see, looking at the 2 years together, that the River S variability was real and significant but also bounded. There were levels it had never reached in Bray's record and, so far, had not reached in hers. There were conditions it produced reliably at predictable times of year. The river was not random. It was variable within patterns, and the patterns could be read if you paid attention to the same thing for long. She thought about this in the context of her family. Her mother S. health was variable, better some years than others, crisis-prone in certain seasons, more stable in others. Her brother S. financial situation fluctuated. These were not random. They were variable within patterns. She had been treating the variability as the primary reality and trying to manage against each instance of it as it arose, which was why it had felt endless. Because variability within a pattern is genuinely endless. There will always be another instance. What you could do was read the pattern, learn the ranges, understand which fluctuations were within the normal envelope and which represented genuine crisis requiring response. That was what Bray had done with the river, not eliminate the flooding. Read the flood S pattern and know which years required closed crossings and which were manageable. She woke the next morning to a sound she had not heard in 4 days, rain on the corrugated metal roof. It came in hard, driving sheets from the southwest, and the river responded to it almost immediately, rising visibly during the hour she lay on the bench listening, the tone of the current shifting from a steady rush to something heavier and more purposeful, the sound of water that has more mass behind it moving faster than usual. She put on Clement Bray-S oilskin jacket and trousers and sou'wester hat, which fit her reasonably well, and stood in the doorway of the hut watching the river rise. The steel cable was still in place, catenary curve now altered by the higher water pressing against its length. She could see the mooring post on the far bank through the rain, a heavy iron post set in a concrete footing at the water-s edge, still solid, the cable attached to it with a shackle that appeared intact from this distance. The cable sagged more than it had in calm conditions, the current pushing against its entire length and pressing the midpoint down toward the water. When the water rose further, the cable would dip below the surface at the midpoint. If it rose further still, the cable would drag, and if it dragged with sufficient force, the cable attachment points, at the hut-s wall mount and at the far mooring post, would begin to take load they were not designed to manage indefinitely. She spent the rain day checking the wall mount. It was a cast-iron fitting, bolted through the front timber framing with massive lag bolts that went all the way through the beam and were secured on the inside with heavy nuts and washers. She inspected each bolt in turn, looking for deformation or movement in the timber around the bolt holes that would indicate the wood had compressed or cracked under cable load. She found none. The fitting and the framing were sound. The cable moved at the wall mount when the current pushed it, but the movement was the cable itself, not the fitting. The fitting held. The rain continued all day. She read the logbook. By evening the river had risen 8 inches from its morning level, and the cable was dipping at the midpoint but not dragging. She fell asleep to the rain and the heavier river, wearing the oilskin jacket for warmth, and found it serviceable. She developed in the first winter of operation a practice that she had not planned and could not have predicted. She began reading the logbook entries to passengers who were waiting for the ferry in bad weather conditions, when the crossing was suspended and the wait could stretch to 2 or 3 hours, while the water level receded or the current dropped below the threshold. She did not do this as any kind of performance. She simply found that having the logbook in her hands was useful during long waits, and that reading entries aloud to the people waiting gave the waiting a quality that pure waiting did not have. The entries she read most often were the ones with embedded notes, Bray-S folded papers which she had removed and flattened and mounted inside the logbook-S back cover with small pieces of tape. These notes, in their brevity and their specificity, had a quality that the crossing record itself did not have. They were the moments when Bray had stepped outside the factual record and said something about what he had learned. She read them to farmers waiting for the river to drop, to children from the far bank school waiting for the current to ease, to the occasional tourist who had arrived hoping for a crossing and found the hut closed. She did not explain the notes or contextualize them. She read them as they were. When the current is at its strongest, grip the handle with your whole hand, not just your fingers. And the river has taught me everything mot know. Mot do not know the river. Mot canoe ver kept what to do while mot am crossing it. This is sufficient. The people in the hut listened to these in the specific way that people listen to things that are both simple and true, with a quiet that was different from the quiet of simply waiting, a quiet that had something working in it. She did not know whether this was useful to the people who heard it. She knew it was useful to her. Each time she read the notes, she heard something slightly different in them, the way you hear something slightly different in music you know well, depending on what state you are in when you hear. The river remained the thing it had always been. The notes contained what Bray had understood about how to be in relation to it. The understanding was not exhausted by reading. It was available again, fresh, each time she returned. She deposited the $44,000 in the county bank in the township seat, 10 miles up the valley road, on a Monday morning when the rain had cleared and the river was receding back toward its normal level. The banker, a methodical man named Crawford, who had been processing the deposits of the valley's residents for 30 years, looked at the currency, looked at Mara, looked at the lien transfer receipt she had brought as documentation, and then processed the deposit without further comment. He had encountered stranger things in Valley Bank. She returned to the hut and began making a list, not a financial plan. She did not yet know what the ferry operation would require or whether restoring it was feasible. A materials. She spent 4 days examining the winch in detail, identifying every component that needed to be freed, cleaned, and re-lubricated, and every component that needed to be replaced outright. The main gears were sound but required thorough cleaning and re-greasing. The shaft bearings were seized and needed to be pressed free, cleaned, and repacked with fresh grease. The crank handle S wooden grip had dried and cracked and needed to be replaced. The cable drum S ratchet mechanism, which prevented the drum from running backward when load was released, needed to be disassembled, cleaned, and reassembled with new spring tension. The cable itself was the most critical question. It was still in place, still taking the load of spanning the river, still attached at both ends. But it was 50 years old. Steel cable fatigues with use and time. The individual wires that make up each strand work against each other under load, and over time they begin to fail individually, the broken wires showing as small bright protrusions from the cable S surface, what the industry calls bird caging or fish hooks. She examined the entire visible length of the cable with a rag wrapped around her hand, and found 6 sections vei hat broken wires within the first 30 feet from the hut wall. She did not examine the section underwater. She ordered a full replacement cable from a marine supplier, the same specification as the original based on the data plate she found on the winch drum S core, and waited 12 days for it to arrive. The caulking of the ferry hull had required her to develop, over the course of a week, a sensitivity in her hands that she had not previously possessed. The caulking iron was a blunt, wedge-ended tool, and the mallet was a wooden maul, and the technique was straightforward in description and demanding in execution. You drove the cotton into the seam with the iron, using the mallet to seat, and you could tell by the sound of the mallet strike and the feel of the iron whether the cotton had been driven deep enough or not. Too shallow and the cork would compress and move under hydrostatic pressure, leaving a gap. Too deep and you would split the planking, enlarging the seam rather than sealing. The correct depth produced a specific mallet sound, a solid, full resonance rather than the hollow, tinny sound of underdriven cotton or the splintered, damp sound of overdriven work. She had not been able to distinguish these sounds reliably on the first day. They all sounded like a mallet on an iron-on wood to her unhabituated ear. By the 3rd day she could hear the difference clearly. By the 5th day she could drive the cotton correctly by sound alone, without checking visually or by feel, the mallet tone guiding the hand as accurately as any instrument. This was a knowledge that lived in the ear and hand rather than the mind. She could not have explained it to someone in a way that would allow them to replicate it from the explanation alone. They would have needed to drive cotton for 3 days and develop the same ear independently. This was true of most of what she had learned in the valley. The current S feel through the crank handle, the cable tension at different water levels, the sound of the ratchet pawl engaging correctly versus engaging at the edge of its range. These were body knowledge, not mind knowledge, and they had been built by repetition in the presence of the thing being learned. No amount of reading Bray's logbook had given her these things. The logbook had told her what to look for. The crossings had given her what to feel for. There was no shortcut between the instruction and the competence. There was only the doing. The winch restoration took 6 weeks. She worked alone, methodically, using the technical reference manuals she ordered from a machinery supplier and the detailed maintenance notes she found, folded into the back pages of Clement Bray-S' logbook, where he had documented the Winch S' complete mechanical specifications in his careful hand. The work was physical in the specific way of mechanical restoration, not heavy lifting, primarily, but sustained application of force in controlled directions, the use of improvised tools to access components that standard tools could not reach, and long periods of waiting for penetrating oil to work or for soaking baths of solvent to dissolve the accumulated residue of decades. She found she was good at mot-fee this in the same way she had been good at the inventory management in the warehouse, not from any particular mechanical instinct, but from the same precision and patience she brought to any systematic task. She documented her own work as she proceeded, keeping a parallel logbook alongside Bray-S, noting what she found and what she did and what result was produced. The documentation was initially just for her own reference, to avoid repeating steps she had already completed. It became, over the 6 weeks, something more, a record of understanding accumulated, a register of competence developing. Each entry in her log represented a component of the winch she had addressed and released from its seized state. Each entry meant one less obstacle between the machine and its function. The gearbox was the last major assembly she addressed. She removed the gears one by one, soaking each in a solvent bath and then cleaning the teeth individually with brass wire brushes and polishing the bearing surfaces with fine steel wool until they ran smooth under the flat of her thumb. She repacked the shaft bearings with fresh grease from the marine supply. She reset the third stage reduction gear to its correct mesh with the drum shaft and adjusted the clearance between the gear faces to the specification in Bray-S note. When she reassembled the gearbox and turned the crank handle for the first time, she felt the gears engage through all 3 stages, felt the mechanical advantage multiplying her input through each reduction, felt the cable drum begin to rotate with a smoothness and a resistance that was exactly right, that communicated through the crank handle the full mechanical state of the machine below it. She kept cranking for a full minute, feeling the gears run, and then stopped and stood quietly in the hut, listening to the river and to the sound of gears ticking down to stillness. The winch's mechanical complexity rewarded time spent kept at it in the way that any well-engineered thing rewards sustained attention. She had spent 6 weeks restoring it and thought she understood it, and then discovered, in the 2nd month of operation, that she had been wrong about the adjustment range of the ratchet pawl, the small, spring-loaded component that engaged the ratchet wheel on the drum and prevented the cable from running backward under load. She had set the pawl to what seemed a correct angle during reassembly and had run the winch for 3 weeks without incident, and then on a high water morning when the current was strong and the load on the cable was at the upper end of its normal range, she had felt the pawl slip, a single, clean, shocking backward rotation of the drum that took up 6 inches of cable before the pawl re-engaged and held. The passengers on the ferry at that moment, a farmer and his wife going to the near bank market, felt the boat lurch and looked at her. She said, "The ratchet adjusted itself. We refined." She gripped the handle with her whole hand as Bray had advised and finished the crossing without further incident. Then she took the boat back to the near bank and pulled the gearbox cover plate and inspected the ratchet assembly, and found that the pulse engagement angle was at the edge of its designed range when the ratchet wheel was under high load, which was why it had slipped. She adjusted the pull spring to increase the engagement force, retensioned the spring with a small tool she had made specifically for this component, and tested the assembly by applying maximum hand pressure to the crank in the reverse direction. The pull held. She replaced the cover plate and ran a test crossing alone. She wrote the incident and the correction in her logbook in the same format she used for everything else. date, description of the failure, analysis of the cause, corrective action taken, verification method, outcome. She dated the entry and filed it under the Winch S mechanical history, which she was building in the back pages of her logbook in parallel with the crossing record. When the log was full and she transferred the data to a new book, she copied the mechanical history forward. The ratchet incident would be in the record permanently as a data point in the ongoing history of the machine and what it required to run correctly. She began maintaining the far bank landing in her third season, taking the ferry across on Monday mornings before the regular crossing schedule began, and spending 2 hours on the far bank checking the dock planking, the mooring hardware, the approach road surface, and the condition of the Cable S far bank attachment shackle. The shackle was the single most critical piece of hardware in the entire crossing system. It was the connection between the cable and the far bank mooring post, and if it failed under load, the cable would release from the far bank and the ferry would pivot on the current and run downstream until the near bank connection also failed, or the hull grounded on the gravel bars downstream. She had purchased 3 replacement shackles of the correct specification and kept them on the shelf in the hut, coated in fresh grease and wrapped in waxed cloth, ready for immediate installation if the in-service shackle showed any sign of deformation or crack. She inspected the shackle visually and by feel at each Monday maintenance crossing, running her thumb along the shackle S-crown and legs and checking the screw pin for any loosening in its thread. She had never had to replace it in 3 years, but she inspected it every month. This was, she understood, the difference between Bray S 41 years and the failures of infrastructure she had seen in the county. The covered bridges that had fallen not from catastrophic event but from deferred maintenance. The county road surfaces that had reached the end of their service life because no one had been inspecting them incrementally and responding to early indicators. Bray had run 41 years on a cable ferry because he had not waited for the cable to fail before replacing it. He had replaced it when the inspections indicated its condition was declining toward failure. The Monday shackle inspection was the same principle. You looked at the thing that would kill you when it failed while it was still not failing, and you kept looking at what failed until the looking showed you it was time to act. She had learned this slowly in the context of her family as well. Her mother's health had patterns. Some of the patterns had early indicators. Her brother's financial situation had warning signs that she could read now from the valley with a clearer view than she had had when she was adjacent to it. She still crossed when crossing was needed, sent money when the genuine crisis presented, made the phone call when the call was warranted. But she was no longer in the current herself. She was on the bank, reading the water level, deciding when the conditions required crossing and when they required waiting. This was the distinction Bray had been making for 41 years. You could love the far bank and still stay on the near bank when the conditions did not support a crossing. You could love the people on the other side and still read the river correctly. The love and the reading were not in conflict. They were both part of the. Replacing the cable required help she did not have and found in the form of a retired civil engineer named Marcus, who lived 3 miles up the valley road in a house he had built himself, and who came down to the riverbank one afternoon with a thermos of coffee and a genuine technical interest in the restoration of a working piece of Appalachian infrastructure that he had not expected to see operational again in his lifetime. Marcus understood cable and winch systems from his professional work on bridge maintenance and small hydro projects, he explained. Over the course of an afternoon, the physics of the cable crossing, the catenary geometry, the tension calculations, the minimum braking load requirements given the ferry's rated capacity. He explained the correct procedure for replacing the cable without losing the connection to the far bank, attaching the new cable to the old before releasing it, using the old cable to pull the new one into position, then disconnecting the old from the near bank fitting and attaching the new. The procedure required 2 people operating on both banks simultaneously with a signal system between them. His granddaughter, who was visiting from college and had nothing else to do, took the far bank. The procedure worked on the second attempt. The first attempt produced an entanglement at the midpoint where the old and new cables crossed under the current S-load, requiring both operators to reverse and reset. On the second attempt, Mara held the crank handle steady while Marcus S. granddaughter managed the far bank attachment, and the new cable pulled across cleanly and settled into its correct catenary position with a crisp, solid tension that communicated through the Hut S entire structure when the fitting was tightened. Marcus shook her hand with both of his when they were finished. He said he had crossed this ferry as a child, in the early Mortchincham Saumi Gay, sitting on the rail of a flat-bottomed boat in the morning light while Clement Bray turned the crank. He said he had assumed it was. He stood at the water S edge for a moment looking at the cable, then turned back up the road toward his house. Some sanctuaries are not abandoned, only waiting for the right hands to find them, and when those hands arrive, sometimes the valley itself remembers what it had been. Marcus became a regular presence at the crossing. He had no particular reason to cross. His house was on the near bank, and the far bank held nothing he needed regularly, but he came down to the river in the mornings 2 or 3 times Iagzehat week, and sat on the near bank bench that she had built from pressure-treated lumber bolted to the mooring post, drinking his thermos coffee, watching her take the water level reading, and note it in the logbook and make the morning S equipment check before the first crossing. He did not offer unsolicited advice, which she respected and noted. He answered technical questions when she asked them questions about cable fatigue indicators, about the specific signs of bearing wear in the gear train, about the hydrological dynamics that explained why the current ran faster on the near bank side of the crossing than the far bank side, the channel geometry, he explained. The bend upstream displaced the fastest water toward the near bank, but he did not position himself as a supervisor or a teacher. He was simply there, watching a piece of infrastructure he cared about come back into function under competent management. On a morning in her second spring, he said, Bray ran this crossing for 40 years. Do you know what his secret was? She said she did not. He never tried to hurry a crossing, Marcus said. Other ferries up and down this valley in those years, operators would try to cut the crossing time. Speed was money. Faster crossings meant more crossings per day. Bray charged a flat rate and ran each crossing at mot fee, whatever speed the current required. In flood conditions, the crossing took 40 minutes. He never tried to make it take 30. He said the current always knew. She looked at the water, running at its spring pace, and thought about this for the rest of the day. The current always knows. You can see a river and understand its speed from the bank, and you can think you know how to cross it, and the river will still be the river when you are in the middle of it. The crossing takes the time it takes. The current always knows. The ferry attracted, in its second year of operation, a particular kind of attention she had not anticipated. People who drove out from the county seat and the larger towns up the valley specifically to, not because they needed to cross to the far bank, but because crossing on a cable ferry was something their grandparents had done and they had not. Some of them were elderly, people who had crossed on this ferry as children and remembered the specific sound and feel of it, the cable S resonant hum under load, the particular motion of the flat-bottomed hull as it angled against the current, the smell of river water close at hand. Some of them were younger, people who had read about the restoration in the county newspaper's brief count of it, and were curious about the mechanism. She ran these passengers the same way she ran the farm traffic and the school run. One fare, one crossing rate, attention on the cable, and not on the passenger's experience of the crossing. But she listened when conversations came to her without her seeking them, to what people said. The elderly passengers especially said things she wrote down in the logbook S margin in small handwriting, because Bray had not had occasion to record these things, and she thought they belonged in the record. An old woman named Dorothea, who had crossed this ferry regularly as a child to attend school on the far bank, said Mott used to be afraid of the river when Mott was small. Bray would tell me to watch the cable, not the water. After a while the cable was the only thing Mott saw when we crossed. A man in his 80s who had worked the near-bank sawmill for 40 years said, the winter Bray was sick and the crossing was closed for 6 weeks. We felt it. Not just practically, you could feel the valley was wrong, like a sentence with a word missing. She wrote these things Deoverkepno because they were what the crossing meant to people who had lived alongside it, and because meaning was data of a kind that the water level and current speed did not capture, and because Clement Bray had known this valley and served it for 41 years, and she was trying to understand what she had inherited. The flat-bottomed ferry boat itself was stored in a covered boat shed 200 yards downstream, where Clement Bray had hauled it on the day he closed the hull. It was a heavy, wide vessel built from cedar planking over a steel frame, designed to carry the weight of a loaded farm vehicle across a fast current without capsizing. The cedar had dried over 50 years but not rotted. The shed's corrugated metal roof had kept it dry, and the boat was structurally sound in all the essential ways, though the caulking between planks had dried and would need to be renewed before the hull was watertight. Mara had never caulked a boat. She learned from a booklet she found in the boat shed, a mimeographed instruction pamphlet from a boat-building association, dating from the Mortninchin Salmi Gay, tucked into the same niche where Bray had stored the caulking tool. The tools themselves were sound, a caulking iron, a mallet and several coils of cotton caulking in a tin box. She spent a week on the hull, working systematically from stem to stern, driving the cotton into each seam and finishing with a marine compound she ordered from the same supplier as the cable. She learned during this week the particular patience of watertight work. A seam that looks caulked is not necessarily watertight. A seam that feels tight under the iron is not necessarily tight when the hull is under hydrostatic pressure. You cannot verify waterproofness without water. She would not know until she launched the boat whether her work had been sufficient. This was, she recognized, a completely different relationship with uncertainty than she had been trained into. 4 years of financial management had made her rigorous about verifiable outcomes, about knowing the state of each account before committing the next. Here, the verification came only at the end, when she put the hull on the water and watched to see whether the river came in. She launched on a calm Tuesday in December, standing at the stern with a pole, watching the hull settle into the water and waiting. The river was low and the current was moderate, the hull settled level. She watched the bilge for 2 minutes, then 5, then 10. No water came in. She stood in the cold on a flat-bottomed ferryboat on an Appalachian river and felt for the first time in 4 years that something she had built had held. In the second year, when the ferry was running reliably and the valley had begun to depend on it again in the specific organic way that valleys depend on the things that connect their two sides, Mara began to understand something about the crossings that Clement Bray had understood for 41 years and had noted in a single line in his logbook from Mortninchin. The ferry does not know it is crossing. The people on it know. Keep your attention on the cable and let them keep their attention on the far bank. She had read this note a dozen times during the restoration and had understood it as practical advice, as a reminder that the operatoress job was the mechanism and not the passenger's experience of the crossing. But by the second year she understood it differently. The crossing from one bank to another is a liminal state. You are neither where you were nor where you are going. The people on the ferry, the farmers going to the market on the near bank side, the children from the far bank farms going to the near bank school, the families moving between the two, were in the middle. They could not do anything about the river or the current or the cable tension or the crossing time. All they could do was look at the far bank and know they were moving toward it. Her job was to not also look at the far bank. Her job was to look at the cable, to monitor the tension, to adjust the crank rate when the current increased, to watch the water upstream for debris that might foul the hull. Her job was to stay completely present to the crossing S mechanics, so that the people in her care could be completely present to their own arrival. This division of attention, her full attention on the mechanism, their full attention on the destination, was what made the crossing safe. It was the only thing that made it. She thought about this, often in connection with the 4 years of financial management she had done for her family. She had given her attention to the mechanism. That had been correct. What had been incorrect was her assumption that giving her attention to the mechanism also meant taking responsibility for where the far bank was. The medical bills were the current. She could cross the current. She could not move the far bank. These were different problems, and she had been treating them as the same problem for 4 years, which was why 4 years had been insufficient to reach the shore. The summer of the 3rd year brought the highest water the valley had seen in 11 years, according to the records in Bray's logbook, and confirmed by Marcus, who had his Ove kept no records from the hydrological surveys he had done during his working career. The river reached Saucum Tam feet in late June, below the crossing threshold of Bathang High, but high enough that the current against the cable was at the upper end of Mares' experience with. The ferry ran modified crossings during that period. Lighter loads, no vehicles, the crossing speed reduced to what the winch could manage comfortably against the increased resistance without overstressing the cable S attachment point. She had never operated in conditions this close to the threshold, and she found during those 2 weeks of modified operation that the threshold was a real and meaningful boundary rather than a conservative estimate. At Saucum Tam feet, the current S-force against the cable was substantially greater than at the normal Bay Dane Bornfoot operating level. She could feel it in the crank handle S resistance, which required nearly double the effort per revolution of the drum. She stayed within the operating envelope, ran the crossings at the reduced load, and watched the gauge every morning with the attentiveness of someone who knows the boundary and respects it. On the day the water hit Saucum feet, she posted the suspension notice and closed the hut. The river was at Saucum feet for 3 days. During those 3 days she sat in the hut and read the logbook and waited and watched the gauge, and did not open. On the 4th morning the water level was Saucum feet. She opened the hut and ran the morning crossing and wrote the entry, water level, Saucum fit, current, strong but crossing within envelope, crossings, bar. No unusual conditions. She did not note that she had been waiting 3 days for the level to drop, or that the waiting had required sustained restraint. That was not what the crossing record was for. The crossing record was for the crossing. The waiting was its own record, kept in a different part of her understanding, not in the log. The first crossing under power happened on a Thursday morning in late December, when the light was low and thin and the river ran at its winter level, clear and cold and faster than it looked from the bank. Mara had attached the ferry to the cable guide using the same block and tackle arrangement Bray had documented in his logbook, positioned the boat in the current S-flow, and gripped the crank. She remembered Bray's note, when the current is at its strongest, grip the handle with your whole hand, not just your fingers. She gripped Vekepte hat her whole hand and began to crank. The gears engaged through all 3 stages, smooth and true, the mechanical advantage converting her circular motion into linear pull on the cable pulling the boat forward against the current, in increments too small to see individually but visible across a full rotation of the crank. The river pushed, the cable pulled, the boat moved. It took 27 minutes to reach the far bank, considerably longer than Bray's average crossing time in his logbook, but she was alone, without the practice he had developed over 4 decades. and the river was running at a pace that required more force than the summer crossings she would later make. She touched the far bank and stepped off onto the gravel bar. She stood for a moment looking back at the hut on the near shore, small and solid and specific against the tree line, its corrugated roof the same warm orange as the late December light. Then she gripped the handle and cranked back. She ran 4 crossings that day, alone, transporting nothing. She was calibrating. She was learning what the current felt like at different points in the crossing, where it ran strongest, which angle of the boat to the cable gave the least resistance, how to read the cable tension through the crank handle. She was learning the river the way Clement Bray had learned it, crossing by crossing, year by year, paying attention each time to the same thing, and finding it slightly different each time and adjusting accordingly. She was not trying to control it. She was learning what to do while crossing it. There were days in winter when the river ran at conditions that made crossing inadvisable, not dangerous. She had established a set of criteria from Bray S. logbook and from Marcus S. engineering assessment that defined the operating envelope: water level above Bay Chum high feet, current above a threshold she measured with the stick method Bray had documented, ice presence on the water surface, or debris load sufficient to require continuous monitoring instead of the standard crossing interval checks. When any of these conditions were present, she closed the hut and posted a note on the near bank mooring post: crossing suspended, conditions, water level, current, ice. She had found the format for these notes in the back of Bray S. logbook, where he had kept a supply of pre-printed cards that he had apparently filled out by hand for exactly this purpose, and had manufactured her own in the same format. Closing the crossing was a decision she had initially found difficult. Her 4 years of debt management had been defined by the principle that you did not stop, that you kept working, kept paying, kept the structure functioning regardless of your own condition, because stopping meant letting something fail. The crossing was different. Crossing in unsafe conditions did not keep things going. It put people in danger. A closed crossing was not a failure. It was the correct management of the mechanism S operating envelope. She had needed to learn this distinction explicitly, which surprised her. It seemed obvious when she examined it from outside. But 4 years of operating at personal deficit, of treating her own depletion as a condition to be managed rather than a signal to be listened to, had made the opposite principle feel more natural. You continue, you find more to give, you find a way. The river taught her differently. When the water level hit Bay Chum born feet and the current ran too fast for a safe crossing, you did not find a way. You posted the note and you closed the hut, and you watched the river run and you waited for it to recede. You did not control the river, you waited for it. Waiting was not failure. Waiting was the correct response to the river being what rivers are. She received a letter from her mother in the second spring. It had been forwarded by the post office in her last city of residence, having been sent there and then routed to the Valley address she had registered on the county document. The letter was brief. Her mother had never been much of a writer, and said essentially that she hoped Mara was well, that things were manageable at home, and that she was sorry for the way things had. Mara read the letter sitting on the near-bank mooring post in the morning sun, with the river moving past at its April pace, high and purposeful, carrying the spring snowmelt south. She read it. Then she folded it and put it in the pocket of her oilskin jacket and went into the hut and opened the logbook and wrote the morning's entry: April water level, Bone Chum Tarm fit. Current, strong, crossings, Bamorana Inaga run, noon school crossing, afternoon farm run, no unusual conditions. She wrote back to her mother that evening, a letter of similar brevity, saying that she was well, that she was running the ferry, that the valley was good. She said she hoped things continued to be manageable. She did not say more than this because there was not yet more to say, and because one of the things the river had taught her was the difference between things that could be resolved in a letter and things that couldn't. The relationship with her mother was a crossing she was not yet ready to make, and she had learned from Clement Bray that the correct response when a crossing is not yet ready is to note the conditions and wait. She mailed the letter from the county seat and drove the valley road back to the hut and made the afternoon crossing and the evening crossing and wrote the day's final entry and put the logbook on its shelf and went to sleep to the river sound, which had been present every night for 14 months and would be present as long as she was here, running at its own pace, indifferent to the things on either bank that were still in the process of resolving. She had a visitor in the second autumn who stayed for a week, and whose presence she found, after some initial adjustment, genuinely useful. He was a young man named Peter, early 20s, who arrived on foot carrying an overloaded backpack and said he had heard there was a working cable ferry and had walked 6 miles from the bus stop on the main road to see it. He was not from anywhere near the valley. He was, he told her, in the middle of a trip he had not fully planned and had been making incremental decisions about for 3 months, going where things seemed interesting and staying when they seemed interesting enough to stay for. She gave him the near-bank bench to sleep on and put him to work on the rope work that she had been needing help with, the periodic splicing and inspection of the guide ropes that held the ferry hull to the cable at a consistent angle during the crossing. Guide rope splicing is not difficult to learn, but requires 2 pairs of hands at the critical moment when the splice is being formed, and she had been deferring this maintenance for 2 months, waiting for an opportunity to have a second person. Peter learned the I-splice from the diagram in her boat maintenance manual in 40 minutes, and then helped her rerun 3 of the 4 guide ropes in an afternoon. In the evenings he asked questions, not the questions of a tourist, not what was the history of the ferry or what was she planning to do with the money, but the questions of someone trying to understand how something worked at a more fundamental level than its visible operation. He asked how she had learned to read the cable tension, and she explained the feel of it through the crank handle. He asked how Bray had calculated the gear ratio without modern tools, and she showed him the specification plate on the drum and the way the gear diameter ratios were visible if you knew what to look for. He asked how she had known when the ratchet pawl needed adjustment, and she described the sound and the feel of the slip and the systematic way she had identified its cause. At the end of the week he said, "The way you talk about this, it sounds like the machine is telling you things." She thought about this for a moment and then said, "It is. You have to learn to listen." He nodded at Mortfee this in the way that young people nod when they have heard something they recognize as true, but do not yet have the context to fully understand, and she understood this because she had been that person 4 years before, listening to a river that was telling her things she was not yet able to. He left on a Saturday morning, walking back up the valley road with his overloaded backpack, and she watched him go, and then turned back to the river and took the morning water level reading and wrote it. She ran the ferry for 3 years before anyone used it for its intended purpose, and the person who first crossed as a paying passenger was Marcussette's grandson, who had come back to the valley for the spring and wanted to reach the far bank hiking trails without the 4-mile detour to the bridge. The fare Mara charged was the same rate Bray had charged for a foot passenger in Mortinchin Baby Mort, adjusted for inflation, $3, and she kept a paper ledger in exactly the format Bray had ipete his logbook, date, water level, number of passengers, weather, notes. The far bank had farms on it still. The Halley family was still there 2 generations down, and when word reached them that the ferry was running again, Gerald Witt, grandson, who had been 4 years old on the morning of the last crossing with the dairy herd, came down to the bank one afternoon to stand on the far side and watch the boat come across. He was 50 years old, and he watched the crossing in complete silence, and when the boat touched the gravel bar and Mara stepped off and looked at him, he simply said, "We wondered if it would come back." She did not know how to answer this, and so she did not try. Some things that have been waiting do not need an explanation when they arrive. By the end of the 2nd year she was running regular crossings, a morning run and an afternoon run, Monday through Saturday, with additional crossings by request. She kept the logbook in Braille format, making her entries each evening in the same careful hand she had developed for the warehouse inventory records. Precise, unemotional, factual, water level, crossings, conditions, notes. She was building a record that would sit alongside Braille in the brass tube in the gearbox, available for whoever came after her whenever that happened. She was not in a hurry. The river was not in a hurry. The current moved at the pace the gradient required, and the cable crossed it at the pace the gears ratio allowed, and the passengers arrived when they needed to cross and departed when they had done what they came for. The pace was different from anything she had known before, not the urgent, depleting pace of financial crisis management, not the fixed clock pace of the warehouse shift, but the pace of a thing that recurs, the crossing that happens each morning and each afternoon. The water level that is checked and noted and accepted, the crank handle that is gripped with the whole hand when the current is strong and released when the far bank is reached. She wrote one entry in her own logbook that was not in Braille format. It was the final entry of the first year, made on the last day of December, when the river was low and the night sky over the valley was clear enough to see the stars without obstruction. December balmy Mott, water level, high tang Mott fit current, light crossings, high, no unusual conditions. Mott have been here for 14 months, the winch runs clean, the cable is good, the hull is tight. Mott have not been trying to control anything. Mott have only been pulling, crossing by crossing, and it has been enough. Clement Bray was right, Mort think he knew it would. The sanctuary waits. It has always waited. And somewhere in the county property office, folded under a rubber band with a stack of old lean transfer records, are 9 crumpled dollar bills, the cost of a cable ferry hut, the cost of a way across. She had been thinking about the $44,000 for weeks before she decided what to do with it beyond the restoration. The restoration itself had cost approximately $8,000, the cable, the replacement parts for the winch, the caulking materials and the hull work, the tools she had needed to purchase. The remainder was substantial. She had placed it in the county bank in an account she maintained for the ferry operation, and it sat there accruing modest interest while she thought about what it was for. Clement Bray had low-iepte it in the gearbox, in a sealed brass tube, in a hut he had cleaned and secured on the last day of his working life. He had left it there without instructions about its use. The logbook note said only Mott have put what needed to be put away into the gearbox, which said nothing about purpose. He had trusted the finding to whoever found it, and the use to whatever that person needed it for. This was, she had come to understand, the most radical element of the bequest. He had not earmarked it, he had not specified, he had placed it in the hands of whoever arrived next, and trusted that person S needs to be sufficient direction. She spent the 3rd year using a portion of the remaining funds to rebuild the far bank mooring infrastructure. The landing dock, which had deteriorated significantly in 50 years, and the gravel-surfaced approach road from the dock to the county road that served the far bank farm. This was not altruism in any pure sense. The ferry was only useful if Bayotay Hart banks were accessible, and the far bank landing had become a limiting factor in what could cross. Heavy farm loads that Bray had routinely carried in his era could not safely use the deteriorated dock. She rebuilt the dock to Bray's original specifications, which she found in a construction drawing folded into the back of the gearbox housing behind the tube. The drawing was signed by the county engineer who had originally constructed the crossing infrastructure in Montinchinheimichin, and it showed the dock dimensions, the mooring post-footing depth, and the road grade that minimized the slope for loaded vehicles. She followed it exactly. Some sanctuaries are not abandoned, only waiting for the right hands to find them, and sometimes the right hands find not just the sanctuary, but the original blueprints.